Okay, and it says the recording has started. And okay, so we're still a few minutes early, and so the attendees are showing up in the window here. I'm going to pause the recording. We don't need to record. Well, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you all to the very first Lake County Conservation Council public lecture webinar. We are planning on doing monthly webinars to help people in the county become more educated and familiar about some of the natural features of our county. We have a lot of diversity and a lot of opportunities for advocacy and protection of our resources. So we tonight have two wonderful guests from the Southwest Florida Regional Water Management District, which is a mouthful. They're quite often called Swift Mud, right? You guys are the Swift Mud folks. And we have Mark Fulkerson with us here and Will Vangelder. And they're going to speak to us about the hydrology and the river systems that support the swamp, and also the wildlife corridors and the natural environment that the swamp supports as the Florida wildlife corridors develop, and keep an eye on them. So Mark and Will, thank you so much for joining us. And why don't you guys go ahead and get started?
All right, Susan, thanks for having us on here and giving us a chance to speak to folks tonight. It's good to meet everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so I'm going to turn my video. And you should be able to see my screen pop up in just a moment.
Yes, we can see your screen, and we can see you're not in presentation mode yet, though. There we go. Great.
All right, so very good then. Well, yep, and good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Mark Fulkerson. I'm a chief professional engineer with the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and I'm also a Citrus County native. So I grew up paddling, camping, fishing along many of our area rivers and water bodies in Central Florida. And since graduating from college with a civil engineering degree, I've worked at the Water Management District for the past 15 years. So just a little intro about who I am. What we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to start by stepping back in time a little bit to get a glimpse of some of the history of the Green Swamp. Then we're going to look at what makes it a significant part of Florida's water resources. We're going to also learn a little about its hydrology. Hydrology is the presence and distribution of water on and beneath the earth. So we're going to kind of talk about how that water is in the Green Swamp. And finally, we're going to highlight the river systems that flow from this unique area. And so the Green Swamp includes more than 500,000 acres of relatively undeveloped land in the heart of Central Florida. And we can see it here. We're kind of zoomed into the area of it, but it includes portions of Polk, Pasco, Hernando, Sumter, and Lake counties. And today, the Green Swamp is recognized as an area of critical state concern because of its ecological and hydrologic significance, but its story starts long before that. We go all the way back to 1539. This is when Hernando de Soto was exploring Florida. He came in search of riches and really to be able to claim the land for Spain. And his route, which we can see here on the screen in Florida, led him inland from the West Coast. But before too long, he hit the Green Swamp and he had to turn northward. His armies were forced to turn northward as they encountered really this intimidating landscape. That I can't imagine. It was probably so difficult to traverse back in those days. Now we have all the interstates and roads and everything, but they weren't able to just go right through it. So he turned northward and continued down the Withlacoochee and beyond. And in the Green Swamp today, some of the feral hogs that are out there are actually descendants of those that were brought in by Hernando de Soto. He brought them in as food to feed himself and his soldiers back in those days. So it's kind of an interesting history. Then we move forward to the 1700s. In the 1700s, bands of Creek Indians, they were fleeing conflicts in Georgia and Alabama, and they were coming down to settle in Florida. And eventually they became known as the Seminole Indians that we know in Florida. And for them, the dense forests of the Green Swamp were really a safe refuge, as they were kind of trying to seek a peaceful life there. But that didn't last too long, because by the 1830s, the Seminoles found themselves in a series of conflicts with the U.S. Army, and that eventually led to their removal. But they, hid out and made the Green Swamp their home back in that period. From the 1920s through the 1950s, logging was a big deal in the Green Swamp, and there was a company called the Cummer and Sons Cypress Company, and they operated there. They had a large-scale logging operation, and they were taking advantage of just the plentiful supply of cypress and pine trees that the Green Swamp afforded. And to support their operations, they built a lot of tram roads. These are railroads that traversed in through the Green Swamp, so they could access the highly prized wood of the day. And they were pulling out cypress from those tram roads. They were maybe floating them downriver to a better access point where they could get them out, and sending them northward. And I think I did a little research, and some of the cypress that came from Florida in those days, and they shipped north, they were building stadium seats with it throughout the U.S. And they were also in the World Wars, they were sending it over to Europe to build some of the boats and to use on those things. So kind of interesting. I myself have spent a lot of days walking the backwoods of the Green Swamp, work-related type stuff, and I've seen evidence of these old tram roads that are still out there today, including a lot of old bridge pilings. You can see these old bridge pilings across the river there in the Green Swamp. It's kind of interesting history. But then in 1960, our region experienced widespread flooding. And in 1960, of course, some of us may or may not remember Hurricane Donna back then. That came through in the summertime. But even prior to Hurricane Donna, we had a very, very wet spring that caused substantial flooding in March. And that March flooding was actually greater than the flooding from Hurricane Donna. But then Donna came through as well and caused more flooding. And this not only led to the formation of our water management district in 1961, but it also initiated some pretty large-scale plans to try to manage water in Florida because of that flooding. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen just a couple pictures. We got a lot of them from 1960 that show flooding in different areas. But I showed these two because this little town of Mazarictown is just south of Brooksville. Brooksville in Hernando County is where our headquarters are, and then on down to Tampa. And I was told by an old timer that used to fly a plane between Brooksville and Tampa to deliver mail. He flew this route after 1960 and captured some footage of the flooding. But basically, I'm told that you could take a boat all the way from Brooksville to Tampa after this flood, and you didn't even have to step out on dry ground. All the low areas were just connected. There was just water everywhere. So in those days, Florida was getting developed, and they saw this flooding, and they said, "Oh man, we gotta try to do something to manage it." And one of the ideas that they came up with starting in the 1960s was the Four River Basins Project. And this was intimately related to the Green Swamp area, because at the time they were planning to build a 23-mile long levee that was going to hold better water back up in the Green Swamp. They even wanted to divert the flow to the Hillsborough River. Their plans also included ditches and dikes that they were going to build in the headwaters of the Ocklawaha, where the flows go into Lake County, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But by the 1970s, as they were trying to devise all these plans, and they built some things, nothing in the Green Swamp, but they built some things elsewhere in Florida. By the 1970s, there was a much greater awareness of the catastrophic environmental damage that would have occurred if these projects had been executed. And this was the same time that the Kissimmee River was being straightened south to Okeechobee. The Cross Florida Barge Canal was being dug across Florida. It was all about navigation and controlling water back in those days. And, both of those projects were stopped in the 70s. This is the time period when they realized, hey, we can't do all these things. We're not going to do all these things in the Green Swamp because we'd really destroy it. And we weren't going to get much of a benefit from it anyway. Their studies were showing, because this area just naturally holds a lot of water anyway. And so in 1974, this is when the Green Swamp was characterized as an area of critical state concern by the state. And really things shifted to to purchasing and conserving land. And that's something Will's going to talk about more in a little bit when I'm done. But in the 70s and 80s, we had a lot of programs where we were trying to buy up the land to preserve it and conserve it instead of building all these things. So thankfully, none of those things were ever done. So that brings us back to today. Okay, our little trip through the past. Now we're sitting here in 2021 and talking about the significance of the green swamp. Now, the green swamp is really an assortment of uplands, wetlands, open water that forms a broad, relatively flat plateau of land. So there are slope changes in the green swamp. It's kind of gradual, but it's a really big kind of flat area that has all these different landscapes. And within its boundaries is really this integrated and complex different natural systems. And what we think of a lot of times when we think of swamps are maybe cypress swamps or riverine forested wetlands. So this is the edges of rivers that will flood when the rivers get high. And the green swamp has plenty of those, but for as much wet areas as there are, there's just as much or more areas that are dry most of the time in the green swamp. And so it's not necessarily all a swamp. We also have a lot of hardwood forests, pine flatwoods, and sandhills that make up the different natural habitats and communities of the green swamp. And it sits at a high land surface elevation. This is what's unique about it. It includes some of the highest elevations in Florida. And this map, the darker areas are high ground. As you get lighter, you're getting lower in elevation. And in the green swamp, the land surface varies from anywhere from 75 to 200 feet above sea level. And it is kind of flat, but it does generally slope to the west-northwest in general. That's kind of the way the land slopes, and most of the flow kind of goes that way as well. There are higher land elevations in Florida besides the green swamp. There's some of the ridges and big hills. Maybe we call them the mountains of Florida when you drive through Mount Dora and Dade City and areas like that. But the green swamp itself is also very, very high. All right, so if we look at, where does all the water come from in the green swamp? Well, the source of water is rainfall. And on average, the swamp receives about 53 inches of rain a year. Okay, that's about average rainfall in Florida, depending on where you are. Okay, about 53 inches a year. But much of the green swamp is wetlands or open water. So evaporation rates are really high in the green swamp. A lot of that 53 inches just evaporates right back up to the atmosphere. And you see on this little hydrologic cycle chart, evaporation and transpiration. Transpiration, like evaporation, is the loss of water from trees and plants, from their roots, from their leaves, going back up into the atmosphere. So 45 of those 53 inches on average in a given year are going back up to the atmosphere. That's kind of unique. In Florida, the average is maybe about 38 inches. So we're a little higher evaporation in the green swamp because of all the water surface, and all those plants are just sucking that water up and sending it to the atmosphere when it can naturally. If we look below the land surface, in this little cutout piece of land here in the image, below the land surface, there's a shallow aquifer, shallow superficial aquifer. So if you were to dig in the soil a little bit and get some saturated sand and water, that's your superficial aquifer. It's not too deep. There's and a lot of times when we get a lot of rain, that just fills right up above the surface and becomes the wetlands or becomes the wet prairies. But below this superficial aquifer is a thin layer of clay. Okay, so there's a little bit of clay, and it's very thin though, and it's not continuous everywhere. Below that clay is our Floridan aquifer. So our Floridan aquifer, this is the main source of drinking water in the state of Florida. Okay, and if you're not familiar with what an aquifer is, this is an underground area of rock and sand that holds water. Okay, water's kind of moving through an aquifer like it does through a river on the surface. Okay, in Florida, this rock is limestone. Okay, and in the green swamp, the limestone is generally very close to the land surface. Sometimes, you go out there, you drive around, you walk around, you can see the limestone above ground. Okay, I've seen many areas where you see that lime rock above ground. But this limestone that in the green swamp is about 1,000 feet deep, by the way. Okay, that's how much land there is below the middle of Florida. It's about 1,000 feet deep. This Floridan aquifer, this limestone is very dense, and so the density of it does not allow water to percolate into it very well. okay? And it forces rainfall that occurs in the green swamp to basically hit that limestone in the superficial aquifer and just kind of mound up or stack up on the surface. And this is why we get a lot of wetlands and other areas that hold water out there. Okay, so because the limestone isn't very permeable, okay, or it's very dense, we have very little recharge. Recharge is the amount of that rainfall of that 53 inches that actually makes it to the Florida aquifer, and it's only about 2 inches out in the green swamp. All right, so we talked about how high the land elevations are. Well, because the land is very high in the green swamp, the water levels below ground are very high as well. So our Florida aquifer is at a high point in Florida. It's one of the highest elevations of aquifer levels in the state of Florida. And at its highest, the Florida aquifer groundwater levels are about 130 feet in the green swamp, 130 feet above sea level. Okay, this is the groundwater. This is higher than a lot of people's properties where they live. The groundwater in the green swamp is at 130, and you can see these blue lines represent contours. So these are elevations that change every 10 feet. And I just labeled a few of them here so you could kind of get the general idea that groundwater levels slope down as we reach the coast. And this is all water underground in the aquifer where we have our wells, where we're pulling water out to drink. It's what sustains our life here in Florida. Okay, this groundwater is moving laterally away from the green swamp in several different directions because it's a high point in the aquifer. All right, and rainfall, when it falls in the green swamp, it's going to fill up these vast areas of wetlands and marshes that sit above this shallow limestone. So the limestone forces it to fill up. Here's just a little image of a wetland, and we see water in it. You walk out there, you're going to get your boots wet or your shoes wet. And wetlands are an integral part of the green swamp. They help naturally store floodwaters. If someone were to come into the entire green swamp and just fill in all these wetlands with dirt, and build condos or build it up, that water's got to go somewhere, and it's going to go off site and flood somebody or impact somebody else. So these wetlands are important. They're storing floodwaters, and they're also filtering pollutants that might otherwise enter the aquifer or a nearby river system. Now, these wetlands will dry up certain times of the year. It's normal during the dry season, during the dry winter and spring months, for these wetlands the water levels to go down and maybe completely dry up. And then the next summer they fill back up with rain. That's their natural cycle of them. But when the summer rains do fill up the complex network of wetlands and streams and ditches out in the green swamp, you can get a lot of runoff, a lot of water running off and feeding river systems. And that's what's happening right now. We're sitting in early August. The green swamp's been getting rain and things are filling up out there. Okay, so what I want to do next is just take a look at some of the different river systems. This was the last bullet in my agenda here for this presentation. These different river systems that originate in the green swamp. So here's the green swamp again, just to orient us. All right, it's part of these 5 different counties: Polk, Pasco, Hernando, Sumter, and Lake. And like I said, it's more than 500,000 acres of land, which equates to about 870 square miles. Okay, so it's a big area, largely undeveloped. And it's the headwaters of 4 major river systems. Okay, it's the headwaters of the Withlacoochee, the Ocklawaha, the Peace, and the Hillsborough rivers in Florida. And in the green swamp, there are no dams or water control structures that can control the flow. When the green swamp gets rain and those wetlands fill up, that water naturally is going to leave the green swamp and maybe flow towards one of these 4 river systems. Okay, these flows are natural. They're going to vary based on different rainfall trends. And I'm going to show a couple of pie charts here on the right side. This first one on the upper right represents what % of the green swamp area is in each of these river systems. Okay, so 82% of the green swamp itself is the headwaters of the Withlacoochee. All right, about 15% is in the headwaters of the Ocklawaha, and then the Peace and Hillsborough include much smaller pieces of the pie there. Okay, so that's just the area of land that represents the green swamp for each of those river systems based on the land elevations. But here's the percentage of flow that's attributed to each river system. The Withlacoochee is actually going to get about 91% of the flow leaving the green swamp naturally. The Ocklawaha even though it's 15% of the green swamp area, it's only going to get 4% of the flow, just based on how the ground naturally slopes out there and the creeks and how things are. All right. Of these 4 river systems, 3 of them are in our water management district, the Southwest Florida Water Management District, the Withlacoochee, the Peace, and the Hillsborough. The Ocklawaha is in the St. Johns River Water Management District, so I'm not as familiar with that one, but regardless, we're going to take a closer look at each of these 4 river systems. Okay, so first to the Hillsborough, I'm just going to show a map of each of them and a couple pictures and just give you a few nuggets of information. So the Hillsborough River starts at the southwest corner of the Green Swamp, and it meanders about 54 miles southwest into Tampa Bay. Now, most of the flow in the Hillsborough River does not come from the Green Swamp. It actually comes from springs along the Hillsborough River or other tributaries that flow in, like Cypress Creek or Flint Creek. And there are a handful of days each summer, though, when the Hillsborough will receive some contribution of flow from the Green Swamp. And this contribution is actually overflow from the Withlacoochee River. So if we were to look at this southwest corner of the Green Swamp, we would see just a wide plateau of wetlands. And we would say, hey, when the water in this area gets high enough, it's going to pop over those wetlands and start flowing to the Hillsborough. We have had flow to the Hillsborough this summer. It's not very much right now, but we have had flow this summer because of some good rains out in that area. Okay. A couple other notable things about the Hillsborough River is one of the projects from that old Four River Basins project back in 1961 that they started. Remember, after the flooding in 1960, they did build the Tampa Bypass Canal, which diverted water from the Hillsborough directly into Tampa Bay to save some of the highly developed areas of Tampa that were flooding, and that no doubt would have flooded many times since then if it wasn't for that canal. On the Hillsborough River in that area as well, there's a reservoir, and the city of Tampa takes some of that water from the Hillsborough, they treat it, and it's a source of drinking water for city of Tampa residents. And one other fact about the Hillsborough is one of the big springs in the Hillsborough River called Crystal Springs. You may or may not know it's one of the sources of Zephyr Hills bottled water. So you go to the store and you see Zephyr Hills, that's coming from one of these springs here on the Hillsborough River is one of the sources. So just some tidbits of information. I'm not advocating one way or another for any of those topics, just sharing information. All right, the Peace River, although it's only about 2%, only about 2% of the Green Swamp is in the headwaters of the Peace River. It does get some flow at times from just that southern little side of the Green Swamp. But the true headwaters of the Peace River are Lake Hancock, which gets some flow from Saddle Creek, and also the Winter Haven chain of lakes. Winter Haven, Lake Alfred, near Lakeland. So these areas, Peace Creek flows through those lakes into the Peace River. The Peace River is about 106 miles long, and it flows into Charlotte Harbor on the southwest coast of Florida. Okay. We'll talk about the Ocklawaha and ultimately the St. Johns here for a couple minutes. There's a narrow strip of land on the eastern edge of the Green Swamp. This is the headwaters of the Ocklawaha River. This is the only portion of the Green Swamp that actually flows north into Lake County, is this little strip of land here, just based on land elevations that are natural. Okay. And like I said, about 15% of the Green Swamp is a contributor to the Ocklawaha based on area, but it really only gets about 4% of the flow leaving the Green Swamp, just because of how water naturally moves. Okay, moving north into Lake County. So what is that area of the Green Swamp? Well, it's a series of wetlands and sloughs, and really during the wet season, if there's enough rainfall, it'll slowly push some water northward into the Palat-Lakaha Creek, in Lake County, then up through the Harris chain of lakes, and ultimately into the Ocklawaha River. Okay, but contributions from the Green Swamp to the Ocklawaha up into Lake County are seasonal, and some years there's just not enough rain at all to fill the swamps and provide any flows, and it just kind of depends. This year, we've been pretty wet actually for the past few years out in this area. So there's been flow moving from the green swamp into the lakes and river to the north there, Ocklawaha. But I do want to mention that, if you look at the Harris chain of lakes in Lake County, and just where a lot of this water comes from, most of it comes from rainfall directly on that lakes or on surrounding land that flows in. So just very little of it actually is coming from the green swamp. Green swamp is the headwaters of it, but it is not the main source by any means of water flow into the Ocklawaha. They're getting rain directly on them and in more local areas. Okay. The Ocklawaha is a tributary of the St. Johns, as you may know, and it joins the St. Johns River just downstream of Lake George. The Ocklawaha is about 74 miles long, while the St. Johns River is over 300 miles long, and it's by far the longest river that we have here in the state of Florida. Along with the Withlacoochee, it flows northward. Some folks say, how can it defy gravity and flow north? Well, it doesn't. It flows downhill to the north. There's an equal number of rivers in the world that flow north, south, east, and west, and they just flow from high elevation to low elevation. So it flows north, but that's just the way the land elevations slope in this area. Okay, and a couple of pictures of those rivers as well. All right, and the final one I'm going to talk about here for a few minutes is the Withlacoochee River. Now, like I said, the majority of the flow leaving the green swamp heads down the Withlacoochee. And if we look at where the green swamp is related to this Withlacoochee watershed or Withlacoochee basin and the creeks in it, you can see why. Remember, land elevations slope from the east towards the west and to the northwest. So rain that hits the majority of the green swamp is flowing into creeks and wetlands that overtop and eventually end up in the Withlacoochee River. The Withlacoochee winds about 160 miles northwest and eventually discharges into the Gulf of Mexico near Yankeetown. Now, this is the system that I am most familiar with personally, just because I grew up in this area. I'm a Citrus County native. I also spent my first 2 summers at the Water Management District walking this entire river channel through the green swamp. There's about 40 miles of it. I walked it and surveyed the river bottom all the way through. Here's a couple of photos of us doing this. When we did this, because we were trying to characterize how water moves through the green swamp, and we were building a computer model to simulate flows for the entire river system. And in the green swamp, like I said, about 40 miles. It took us 2 whole summers. We collected about 5,000 bottom elevations to map out the bottom. And we did this during the summers of 2007 and 2008. They were pretty dry times. So I'm going to show a few photos here of the green swamp, the Withlacoochee that runs through the green swamp, and talk about some things. And the photos were when water was low. Now this top one is me. This was me about 15 years ago or so. On the bottom photo, this was our 18-year-old intern out of high school named Ben. Okay, and you can see where we put Ben. Not really a desirable place to go walk down into the river bottom. It's duckweed on top. You can't see anything. And when we surveyed it, all the water was just in pockets. Water wasn't really moving. It was just stuck in pockets. And do you know what else is stuck in those pockets? Those big lizards in Florida we like to call alligators. So we just told Ben, we need an elevation right there in the middle of the river. So just walk on out there, take that survey rod and move it in front of your feet, left and right, and all the gators will go away and you'll be fine. And so he survived, and we ended up surveying the whole river system. What I'll show you this photo real quick. So this is my size 12 rubber boot. Okay, it's over a foot in length, this boot. And I'm standing next to a gator track that we found at one location in the green swamp. And that gator track is matching my boot size, very, very large. The local told us there that was George. He was a 13-foot gator, and that was his territory, so we better respect him. But I just want to share that photograph with y'all. All right, so just about the last thing I want to do here in my presentation is I want to share with you some additional photos of the green swamp here. And again, the Withlacoochee is the river that flows through the green swamp, draining the majority of it. This map shows the green areas are conservation land. So Will's going to talk about this, some of the lands that we've purchased to conserve the green swamp. And what we're going to do is we're going to jump in this little boat. and we're going to take a little trip downriver together. And I just want to share with you a few photographs as I get ready to close out my portion. Okay, so as we work our way down, we're going to stop right here, and here's a photo that shows the main channel of the Withlacoochee River. This is the main channel. There is no channel, right? It's just about a mile wide of swamp, of forested wetland, and the water just kind of meanders through this area. What's interesting is upstream of here there was a channel, and downstream of here there's a channel. But that's what happens in the green swamp. Just geologically and topographically, these areas are different as the river meanders through there. Okay, we'll go a little bit farther and we'll see what looks more like a river channel. Here we see a couple of banks, and you can see the trees on the side now. Again, this was taken during very low water times. I'm going to move my mouse. I don't know if you can see it in this Zoom meeting, but there's a high water mark on one of these trees where the white lichens come down and then stop. It's way, way, way up there above the water. And that gives you an idea of that water's, 6, 7, 8 feet deep on the land there. So when it's high, it's just spread out everywhere. We'll go down a little bit farther, and here's an image of some lime rock. This is that limestone aquifer that's peeking out to the surface, and we can get a glimpse of it there on the surface. Okay, this was a very interesting area because the river wasn't flowing through the green swamp. It was a dry time, but this was a little area that was flowing because just upstream of there, water levels in the aquifer were higher than the surface, and so they were pushing water out into the river, and it was flowing through these rocks. And then about 100 yards downstream, it just soaked back into the ground and was gone. So it's kind of an interesting area there. Going to march down a little farther. You see here on the map down at the bottom, the Hillsborough River. Remember I talked about the Hillsborough River. It'll pop off, and this vast wetland will contribute flows out of the Withlacoochee when it's high enough. Here's a bridge that's just downstream of their intersection of those rivers. Okay. This bridge goes to about 400 acres of private property in the middle of the green swamp. You see this white little rectangle there down by the boat to the right. That's an area of land that's not it's not state land. It hasn't been purchased for conservation. It's private land out there. And this bridge is their driveway. And if you were to go across this bridge, you would quickly find out that those cypress boards on top are not nailed down. And that's just because when they rot out, they throw them off and then put a new one on. And when I've driven over this bridge a few times, you hear a kaplunk, 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 and you just hope, that you're going to be able to make it across. It's a little harrowing to drive across this bridge. We're going to go down a little bit farther and see just a few more photos. Here's another area where in the previous photo it looked wider. Now it narrows up again. This is just this very narrow channel. But again, in the foreground, you see this cypress tree. Here's a high water mark way up there. So when the water level's high, you're not going to find this channel. There's just water spread out everywhere out in this area. A little farther down now, and the channel looks totally different. Here we have a very wide area. There's no banks to it. When this is dry, it looks like a football field, a grassy football field. Very flat, very interesting. And then finally, as we exit the green swamp on the Withlacoochee, remember this is the river system that actually flows through the green swamp. When we exit it, we're seeing these high banks again. This is where we're getting into private properties. This is where people now live on the high banks. We're getting out of the green swamp. And this is an area where the river really experiences pretty high fluctuations because all that water in the green swamp is trying to pinch through this narrow channel now that's bounded by these high banks. And some folks in this area do experience high water from time to time. Okay, so I just want to close my presentation with this interesting map. This was from the 1850s, and it actually shows proposed canals from Tampa Bay all the way across Florida to the St. Johns River. Can you imagine a canal or a waterway from the St. Johns River over to Tampa Bay? No such thing exists, but back in these days, they were planning one. Here's Lake Harney, Lake Monroe, in Seminole County, I believe. It also shows a proposed canal that branches off from that and heads north right through the heart of the green swamp to the Ocklawaha River. And so this was a survey that was done to try to map out, hey, how can we get across Florida? How can we navigate? Because we didn't have the railroads, we didn't have the highways that we have today. It was all little steamboats and river travel to get around. And so kind of an interesting time. these plans didn't last long because the railroad came, and thankfully that these canals were never built, because they would have no doubt caused some pretty irreversible ecologic and hydrologic damage to the green swamp. But it's just kind of interesting history to find these old maps. But thankfully, none of that ever came to fruition, and we've been able to preserve and protect this magnificent resource that is the green swamp. So that is my presentation. And I think, Susan, I'm going to give way for Will next, right?
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. And then we'll switch over to Will, and he's going to talk about the wildlife corridors aspect of this whole area. And put it in the chat window. If anyone who's listening has questions, please type them in, and we will field them after both speakers. And we'll get some more information. So yeah, Will, are you ready to talk about the wildlife corridors?
Yeah, that I am. I'm gonna see if I can't get my presentation up here, and you just let me know when you're able to see.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get going.
See that. Yep,
excellent.
Got it.
Excellent. Well, as Dr. Fulkerson mentioned, we truly appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with your group. My name is Will Vangelder. I am a senior environmental scientist with the Southwest Florida Water Management District Surface Water Improvement Management Program. Our program focuses mainly on two objectives, and that is the restoration and preservation of natural systems within our district, as well as water quality projects to sustain healthy environments. We are in all or part of 16 counties. We do include the southwest corner of Lake County, and that's where we overlap with the Green Swamp. District ownership is bordered on the east side of our ownership by the Van Fleet Trail. And we own and manage roughly 115,000 acres of the Green Swamp. However, when you combine it with Florida Forest Service's Rich Loam Tract and FWC's properties up there with the WMAs, you're looking at roughly 240,000 acres of conservation lands within the Green Swamp. In addition to state ownership, and that's in fee title, meaning that we hold the deed. In addition to that, one of the conservation strategies in the state of Florida are conservation easements. And these are opportunities to partner with the private sector that is interested in maintaining conservation values on their properties. We're very fortunate in this state to have a lot of large landowners that still value the ecological services and just, to be honest with you, the natural beauty of many of the Florida ecosystems. Many multi-generational families out there that still teach and have great value in what the state of Florida provides. It's an amazing state. You're not going to find these ecosystems elsewhere. And we're very fortunate to have not only the opportunity as an agency to participate in preservation and restoration, but very valuable large landowners that participate in conservation, that we would not be where we are today without both entities. So I've been with the Water Management District for 19 and a half years. I began in the Land Resources Program as a senior land management specialist. In this role, we were assigned lands and we managed to maintain. We had a prescribed fire program, very active prescribed fire program, as well as restoration of some of these natural lands. When we purchase these lands, they come in various states, and it's our legislative directive, when possible, to restore these lands back into functioning ecosystems. One of the great aspects of me coming on to the Water Management District is I was paired up with a gentleman named Paul Elliott, and he's kind of a little he's rather famous around the Green Swamp. Paul would he would go and apply fire to these landscapes very aggressively. Was not uncommon to be in any of the 5 counties that have a portion of the green swamp within their boundaries to see large plumes of smoke. That was a water management district, and I would say 60, 70% of the time that was Paul Elliott. You see that quite often there are Bigfoot expeditions into the green swamp, and we always kid around at the water management district is that we think somebody got a glimpse of Paul because he was a large individual, and he just had a gape about him that was easily mistaken from something other than a human being. Um, his other nickname was Shrek, and it was very fitting. Great man, very dedicated to the restoration and maintenance of lands within the water management district, and somebody I learned a lot from. We've got a lot of individuals who've put a lot of effort into the green swamp. You just heard Dr. Fulkerson spent 2 summers mapping out the bottom of the Withlacoochee River. Very dedicated scientists and professionals to the maintenance of what truly is a valuable resource to the state of Florida. So when Ms. Fetter requested of the district certain materials and topics, went through and certainly Dr. Fulkerson was just a perfect individual to present many of the items on the list. But then you get to wildlife corridors, and that's my niche. I've worked not only with the water management district, but I've sat on several committees to evaluate state acquisitions, water management district acquisitions, as well as conservation theories within the state of Florida. And so when the topic on the agenda was wildlife corridors of the green swamp, that really kind of hit at some of the experience I've had over the past 19 and a half years, and I appreciate the opportunity to share those. I did expand upon that a tad, though it was generally directed towards the significance of the green swamp and corridors, which we will talk about. I want to talk about the concept of corridors in general because it is the thread that brings cohesiveness to our acquisition programs here in the state of Florida. It's very important. I want to convey to the group how much thought has gone into when we're applying tax dollars for the sake of conservation. This has come with much scrutiny, much thought, much science, and to a certain degree in the private sector, advocacy for certain acquisitions, but it is rooted in very scientific based assessments of which properties are the right properties and why for acquisition and restoration. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the presentation a little bit further. What you see on my screen now is the most recent version of the Florida Wildlife Corridor Expedition map. There is a group of 3 individuals that on 2 different occasions spent 100 days hiking Florida. I'm a bit envious, though I don't think I could do it at my age. They did it while they were much younger, but they started down in Flamingo, down in the Southern Everglades, and they trekked all the way up from south to north in the state, going through some amazing publicly owned and privately owned lands, all the way up to the Okefenokee Swamp, all the way into Georgia. And they did this to showcase not only the conservation lands that are owned by the state of Florida, but the opportunities that still exist to make real connections for the for preserving biological integrity within the state of Florida. Imagine you're a black bear in South Florida, and jokingly, you decide you want to go on vacation one summer. You want to go see Okefenokee Swamp. A century ago, you could do that. These days, there are a number of obstacles for a species with a wide home range and the ability to move to preserve biological integrity. There's a number of obstacles to that. This expedition is a way to message to the conservation organizations, both government agencies as well as not-for-profits, non-governmental organizations such as the Audubon Society, Nature Conservancy, the Thousand Friends of Florida, on and on and on. There's a number of key groups that have a vested interest in being able to maintain the integrity of biological species within the state of Florida. The second trek is where the Y, you'll see the arrow heading west. That's the trek that actually it branches off right around Disney Wilderness Preserve, and it goes through the Green Swamp. And this corridor comes across the Green Swamp, goes up the Withlacoochee River. As Mark has already pointed out, it's a very significant hydrologic feature of the state of Florida, and the Water Management District has done great measures to protect many of the lands that border the Withlacoochee River. And because of that, there is a viable corridor leading from the Green Swamp over into the Springs Coast. And it makes that bridge right around the Chassahowitzka area and further north up into Crystal River, Kings Bay. But then that corridor links into the Florida Gulf Coast hammocks. This is a product that is really an opportunity to message. It messages the citizens, it messages politicians to garner support for the opportunities that still exist here in the state today. But as we recognize, these opportunities are quickly being, pressure is being applied to the opportunities to make these real connections. This is not a new concept. I'm trying to get this to go to the next slide. Okay, now that concept that you saw is pretty much reiterated in what seems to be the back of a napkin in a publication from back in the 80s. This is some of the work from Reed Noss. Reed Noss and Larry Harris were two individuals that were very active in promoting the concept of not just what you'll see as the core preserves, which are in the dots, but how to connect those core preserves through corridors in an effort to promote the integrity of biological entities within the state of Florida, maintaining biological integrity. You will notice that many of these corridors follow the river systems. So when we look at these corridors, one of the things that many of the early scientists and researchers and even politicians agreed upon is that if we co-locate these corridors with the riverine and tributary systems, when we spend money on conservation lands or even conservation easements to protect the natural integrity of these species of Florida, that you are also maximizing the resource benefits. You can now look at these corridors that provide biological integrity, also providing flood protection, as well as natural systems, which is another key concept in the Florida legislation. When you look at many of the acquisition dollars that are tied to programs that the various agencies use to protect the natural systems of the state of Florida. This concept that was basically on the back of the napkin even dates back further. So back in the 30s, you had individuals such as George Wright looking at many of the natural parks and coming up with the realization that though we have a wonderful collection of amazing national parks, it wasn't really enough to provide biological integrity of large ranging species. So from the 30s, the thought was already in many of the researchers' minds that it's not enough. And how are we going to preserve many of these natural resources that we have that need more in order to persist? These concepts started to really take hold in the 60s and 70s. You had E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur that came up with the theory of island biogeography. And what this is basically stating is looking at major continents with islands offshore of the continents, there was a trend. The bigger and the closer, the larger islands that were closer to the landmass had much greater species diversity than the smaller islands located a distance from the mainlands. If you think about it, that's exactly where we're going, in that many of these core areas are becoming increasingly isolated and becoming islands of biodiversity. And the greater the size and the closer they are to other larger core conservation areas, the more species diversity you have and the greater biological integrity of the species that exist. That led to many of the state initiatives and continued thoughts, like you saw on the back of that napkin, of how do we connect these larger core properties to preserve biological integrity and other resource benefits that we derive from conservation lands in the state of Florida. So the state initiative started to follow the science and the theory and the science that we need to start investing into the ability to make these real connections from the core properties. State initiatives, including the Save Our Rivers Fund, which is tied to the Clean Water Act, directing exactly what we should invest in and how we need to manage it for not only species integrity, but also resource benefits such as flood protection, natural systems, restoration opportunities, and making these real connections. In the 80s, as I mentioned earlier, Larry Harris, Reed Noss were some of the individuals that led the charge for research going into ecological connectivity and the benefits that come from ecological connectivity. At the same time, the state was struggling to find ways to preserve the Florida black bear as well as the Florida panther. These species were dwindling at an alarming rate. The Florida panther was basically isolated to the very southwest corner of Florida, and that's really only because you could not develop it. It was just way too wet, and that's what saved that species. The Florida black bear, that species was relegated to basically 7 populations around the state. And again, that concept of the smaller that pocket and the more distant from other core areas for the Florida black bear, the more stressed those populations were. So in some of the research that was ongoing by a professor, Dr. David Mayer, out of the University of Kentucky, it became rather evident that our land holdings as a state were not enough to preserve the Florida black bear in their population. And that's when it became evident that there were a number of private landowners that were really the stronghold for much of the Florida black bear population. And that's when we started to recognize the benefits of public-private interactions and agreements and working together with the private landowners who are doing a phenomenal job of preserving Florida ecosystems. And it was many of these examples of private ranches that were the reason why many of these populations were able to persist. Beyond that, into the 1990s to present, additional programs such as P2000 and Florida Forever were major funding sources to continue much of the conservation work that had occurred previously. For a stretch, there was over $300 million a year going into acquisition and management of many of these conservation lands. We were able to make great strides. And today we have a very robust conservation program, arguably the best conservation programs as a state in all of the United States. We've made great strides. We have a ways to go, and we have a lot of stressors on our conservation programs. But when you look from state to state, I would not want to compare ourselves to much of the federal lands out west, but as a state, we've made great contributions to the resources in protecting many of the critical areas and the connections around the state of Florida. In that time as well, there was a group, 1,000 Friends of Florida, and they were working with several other not-for-profits, and they took the concepts of Larry Harris and Reed Noss about looking at these core properties and how to make connections. These groups started to work with other research entities, mainly out of the University of Florida, to um, start looking at these networks and how do we capture the science that exists to state, okay, we've identified the corridors. What are the most valuable? How do we prioritize these corridors to get the greatest ecological lift for the limited resource, which is dollars of investing into conservation? Their efforts led um, to the Office of Greenways and Trails, which is actually a section within DEP. Much of the work that occurred through the Florida Greenways was the impetus to start the Greenways and Trails. Greenways and Trails has two major objectives. One is to identify recreation corridors throughout the state of Florida, but of a higher value, identify these ecological corridors to connect core properties to maintain the biological integrity of the species, as well as promote water resource benefits around the state. The work of the Office of Greenways and Trails was again incorporated into much of the work at University of Florida to produce Florida Ecological Greenways Network. And that's where these prioritized corridors was mapped out in GIS in a way of taking the science of greenways and corridors and expressing them in a priority system. Going to move forward. This is a caption of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, where the dark green are existing conservation lands, and then the dark blue and light blue are the primary and secondary identified corridors, so that when the state is looking at, well, we have funds to invest, where is the greatest bang for the buck, both ecologically and from a water resources perspective, where do we invest our funds? There's a lot of science that has gone behind the creation of this GIS database in indicating to the state, where should we be investing our dollars? If you look at this map, you'll see, I'm not sure if you can follow my cursor, but you have the green swamp. Okay. And on the east side of the swamp, it's identified as the opportunity for additional conservation. Much of this area already exists in conservation easements. There's also a large landowners that have maintained their property and mostly agricultural purposes, but in a way that's still viable for biological, for species to move in and out of the green swamp. You will also see that is the southwest corner of Lake County. That blue area is also consistent with the green swamp area of critical state concern. It made that list because of actually on the east side of the green swamp, you have a ridge that runs through that part of the state and recharges very significant in that area. Though, as Dr. Fulkerson mentioned, within the green swamp itself, most of what has been protected to date is very flat lands, and the recharge may not be as high as what's on the east side. The east side does pretty good when you start to get into the ridges. Now, if you also look at where Lake County is situated on the northeast corner, you start getting into the Ocala National Forest and the Wekiva River protection area. There's a lot of resources within Lake County that are identified within this Greenway network, and you as a county should be very proud of the natural resources that you have. It's phenomenal natural resources collection that you have within the county. It makes it a very nice place to live and also recreate. So the Florida Wildlife Corridor is an extension of that Florida Ecological Greenways Network. And what it is, it's really a messaging piece. It's a piece that many of the non-governmental organizations, as well as many of the agencies, have utilized to um, convey the message of what is a critical piece within, say, our district or within our county. If resources do become available, what are the areas that we should invest in to promote this biological integrity within the state of Florida? And there's many reasons why we would do that. Um, Resources are limited, and in as much as they're limited, there is a return on investment. These natural areas produce jobs, they produce um, tourism dollars, tax dollars, they increase the value of property values. That generates tax dollars for many of the municipalities, be it the counties or state and various taxing abilities. But the return on investment for conservation is rather high. This is a closer look at Lake County as we described. In the southwest corner. You have the Green Swamp as well as the Green Swamp area of critical state concern. In the northeast, you have Ocala National Forest, and just below that, the Wekiva River Protection Area. Many of these areas are critical to the concepts of conservation in the state of Florida. As you can see, if you were that bear coming up the existing corridors in the private lands that still exist today in the lighter green, you still have the opportunity to come up and go two ways once you get to that Everglades headwater. You can go east and follow the Kissimmee and St. John's, come across to around Apopka and Ocala National Forest, and continue your journey up to the Okefenokee, or you can take that west branch and move over to the Gulf Coast hammocks. That's the idea behind these corridors. And as you can see, Green Swamp is just that key cog in being able to make the trek westward into the Gulf Coast hammocks. If you, as an individual, would like to investigate further into some of these core conservation areas, as well as the potential corridors, Florida Natural Areas Institute has a Florida Conservation Lands web viewer. You can go in, turn layers on and off, and look at many of the concepts that today kind of play a role into identifying what are the key conservation areas that either exist today or are identified for future significance for acquisition and protection. The reason we pursue this as much as we do these days is because we're in a state of rapid growth and development in the state of Florida. It's not uncommon for a bear to move hundreds, if not thousands of miles as a young male getting pushed out of occupied territory as it's looking for the opportunity to find a territory for itself. It's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the biological integrity as those bears move up and down the state through the corridors, as well as this state being limited in the ability to move east to west. So with projections of population growth, the discussions not only involve where are the corridors, but how do we influence the way in which development expands within the state of Florida to promote not only the biological integrity of species, but the stressed water resources that we have. So there's different alternatives that are being proposed. If you go and look at the 1,000 Friends of Florida, you can look at a lot of the technical work that's gone into land use and planning development into the future to maximize benefits of conservation lands, not just for biological integrity, but the other resources as well, including flood protection and water resources. And with that, that concludes my speech. And as I and Dr. Fulkerson will be available for comments.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We do have several questions. There's some people have asked them in the regular chat window, and then some have put them in the Q&A section. And I think, Banks, if you have been paying attention to that, if you can kind of walk through those a little bit and get some answers for us, that would be excellent.
Sure. So the first one comes from Martin, and it is, do you have a number for the typical open water evaporation rate in inches in the green swamp? And that would probably be Mark or Will.
Yeah, this is Mark. Martin, looks like you got two questions. So sounds like you're trying to parse out, how much is for open water evaporation and how much was, the evapotranspiration from the wetlands. And I don't have that breakdown specifically. I know, of those 53 inches, about 45 is going to go back up to the atmosphere. I don't know if it's kind of half and half out there, or what. It's kind of a breakdown maybe of the open water versus the wetland areas. I know there's a lot of both. Probably more wetlands is what I'd imagine, but I'm not a hydrogeologist that studies that particularly, so I don't have a specific breakdown on that. I just know evaporation and transpiration is the biggest component back from precipitation. Thanks, you're muted, I believe.
Mark, there was a second question with this, and it was, do you have a number of the typical superficial aquifer evaporation and or transpiration? And I think you just answered that, correct?
Yeah, I don't have any additional breakdown besides what I talked about.
Okay, the next question, what percentage of the green swamp is government owned?
Okay, so as Mark had mentioned, the actual footprint of the green swamp is over 500,000 acres. Currently, if you look at fee title ownership, we're about 240, so roughly half of the green swamp proper is under conservation. Now, again, I would argue that there are many private landowners that have tremendous conservation ethics that contribute to the benefits that we receive from the green swamp. But in public ownership is just short of half.
And that was from Nancy. John has something along the same lines, and that is, what can we do to purchase the private properties that exist in the green swamp? And I think John is referring to the space that is there, the bridge that you were talking about, to the private land.
The first thing you need to have is a willing seller, and with ownership comes property rights. And what can we do to increase the amount of conservation lands? I would argue seeking out conservation easement opportunities, working with the public-private opportunities that exist out there. There's a number of conservation easements that already exist. You also need to ask yourself and come to the realization that once the government owns that land, they have to manage that land. That costs taxpayers dollars. With many of the stressors that we have now, maybe many of these lands are best left in private ownership. I'm not saying that we should stop trying to increase conservation in this region. We absolutely should. I am a big supporter of the conservation easements. If the right opportunity for the right piece of land comes along and it's being offered for fee title, that's also a great opportunity. You definitely want to prioritize those portions of the swamp that make connectivity in those corridors. So if you have an opportunity to acquire a piece of property that expands upon ownership within the identified corridors, and you have the same amount of acres that may be along the boundary of the green swamp, but are not within the identified corridors. I would definitely prioritize those that occur within the corridors. We've all, as state agencies and those that are in the academia and universities and non-governmental organizations, have vested a lot of effort into the corridor concept. We've all bought into it. We need to stay consistent to it. The reason these were identified were not only for just expanding the size of a core, but those parcels that provide the greatest resource benefit. It could be from a hydrologic perspective, as well as just making connections to other distant corridors and cores that that produce the greatest benefit.
Thank you, Will. This next one comes from Jane. How does our Florida aquifer get recharged if only 2 inches of rainwater per year flows into it from the green swamp?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I'll take that one. So one thing that's important to understand is, 2 inches is only a small portion of that 53, but it ends up translating to a lot of water. I think statewide, some of the really sandy areas have, like 5 or 6 inches of recharge. That's the max that I'm familiar with in Florida. Other areas, even less than 2 maybe. But 2 inches, if you take that and multiply it by the 560,000 acres of the green swamp, it actually ends up being about 30 billion gallons of water a year. So that's still a tremendous amount of water. Not to mention the periphery of the green swamp, where some of the ridges are and some of the more sandy areas. There, you're going to get the 5 inches of recharge in whatever area that is. So 2 inches doesn't sound like much, but like rainfall, 2 inches over a big area is a heck of a lot of water.
Thank you. From Marion, do you have a current estimate of the acres of the green swamp protected by CEs?
That's a great question. From my recollection, when I was in the land program, between the conservation easements held by the Green Swamp Authority, which is now a division under DEP, as well as the Water Management District, I believe the CEs are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12,000 acres. They're not large tracts for the most part. Some are decent size, up to say 1,200 acres. But if you look at them, they're like postage stamps, mostly on the east side of the green swamp. And so collectively, it's about, I would say, 10 to 12,000 acres. District-wide within our 16 county responsibility, we have roughly 120,000 acres of conservation easements. So as you get a little bit further away, the size of our conservation easements seem to be a little greater, but right there within the swamp, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 acres.
Thank you, Will. Last one from Marion, and that is, I am concerned about the PD&E's rewidening of US 98. There is no mention of wildlife corridors, connectivity, even though green swamp conservation lands and those in the Hillsborough Basin are in close proximity. US 98 could become the new I-4. And I think that was basically a concern, not so much a question. Comments?
We certainly share in concern, and as a district representative, when I say we share in the concern, we have certain responsibilities to the public to maintain the water resources in the natural systems. One thing that has increased with new roadway projects coming from our lessons learned of the past is the requirements for overpasses and wildlife corridors that are identified underneath roadways. It's something that has come from lessons learned and concerns of public from past roadway projects. Roadways are a necessity when you experience the growth that we have. I will just say that there's been a lot of experiences from past roadway projects that influence how roads are built today. But it is certainly a necessary association with the rate of development that has occurred.
Thank you, Will. And the last thing comes from Nancy, and I concur. She said, these guys have a sense of humor. I was chuckling a couple of times. With that, Mark and Will, thank you so much for being with us. And Susan, I will hand it back over.
Excellent, thank you. I think there was one question from Levon. Also, that is, what can you tell us about the controversy or competition between Lakeland and Lake County when there were accusations by one Lake County that the folks down in Polk County were stealing our water? Do you have any input on that? That was a controversy a couple of years ago, I think.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to that because I've been involved in some of the issues going on with some of the Polk County lakes that are really, really high right now, and I understand some of the history there. Part of that portion used to be in the St. Johns River Water Management District. Now it's back in ours, and there were lawsuits and all kinds of things back in those. I think Levon, you're referring to, and I'm not the most educated on that, but what I do know is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how water still moves out in this area. And I think, certainly in recent years, when Lake County went through some dry times leading up to about 2014, and previous dry times in the past, they definitely felt like, well, where'd all the water go? Somebody divert it in the green swamp away from us. And I remember meeting with a Lake County commissioner back in 2014 to try to explain the area. That's not the case. When we're dry, everybody's dry. And that kind of ridge plateau on the east side of the green swamp, there's a portion where, part of it's moving north into Lake County, part of it's going to move south, specifically where like Lake Lowry and just south of Lake Maddie are in Polk County. Many, many miles from the Lake County line, but there is a ridge there where the water goes both ways. But all I can say is there's definitely a lot of misunderstanding, even from elected officials, on how the system works, and we're trying to do our best to educate everyone on that, and those issues are still continuing today. And I just think when things are really wet, usually there's an inference that somebody must have dumped their water on us, and when we're really dry, somebody must be taking our water from us, and 99% of the time it's just because of rainfall.
Yeah, I think that we've heard this kind of controversy a lot in our county. In those years when the lakes were low, there was even people saying that there was pumps installed in some of the lakes in Claremont and pumping the water out of them into some other lakes. People get real grumpy when their lakefront property becomes mudfront instead of lakefront. So, but it is just water. Thank you. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Fulkerson and Mr. Vangelder, for joining us for this. This is an inaugural event for us, and I think it's gone very well. And we're going to continue to try to offer the same high quality of programs to our organization and to our county. So I thank you so much for coming. We are planning this once a month for the attendees here who are new to our organization. We are going to have similar webinars. We're going to try to get them in once a month with different areas of the county and topics that conservation interested people need to know about. If you're not a member of our organization, we'd encourage you to join us. If you're passionate about something in the county, whether it's water or wildlife or the bears or the gopher tortoises, you'll find someone that has a common passion, and we're trying to work really hard together to get effective about advocating for these issues in our county. So you can write to us at info@lcconservation conservationcouncil.org, and that is on our Facebook page. We also have a Facebook page. Reach out to us and join us. We meet once a month, and we try to have interesting programs in our meeting as well. This webinar is being recorded, and once we get the recording back, we'll start a YouTube channel, and you can watch them again on YouTube. So everybody, thank you very much, and have a great evening.
We appreciate it. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. All right, bye now.
Bye-bye.